It's possible to have a subjective experience that you initially cannot tell, or that you cannot discern from one that other people might be having. I mean, an ongoing change in your subjective experience. One that doesn't provide feedback from others necessarily, and in that one knows one is not going schizophrenic. So it would be like if one day you all of a sudden just started feeling like you were high without the debilitating aspects of it. Just a change in the way that you experience reality. And you think initially that it is possibly something that's not the normal mode of being, in that you've lived the majority of your life experiencing reality in one way that you thought was the universal experience by and large. But then this shift comes and you think something has happened to you that is unique. And how you handle that depends on a number of things. But I guess basically your conditioning and your genetics, perhaps. But the example I want to give is what I've talked about many times, is the awakening of the perception of the energy body. The energy body being flavored by the relationship between the thoughts that appear and the reality, and how they align or don't align determines the coloring of the energy body. How that experience is handled is probably also a function of a certain maturity, at what point in one's life it occurs. It's an unusual thing, but if you search enough, you can find examples of people who likely are having or have had this experience, this energetic awakening. Some examples I can think of where that was handled in a way that the person thought like they were really unique, perhaps. Have you ever seen the video Energy Shield Man? There's a guy who just gets pummeled all over his face because he thinks he has an energy shield. Like he's probably perceiving his energy body, and he can perceive that it extends beyond his form. But he thinks it can be used as a deflector of fists. And so he, I guess, does this either challenge or experiment with a guy who just pummels him as he like holds his arms up with an energy shield. I also knew a monastic who had a hermitage of sorts. I don't want to say too much, but they were identifiable as such on a map. And they would routinely get people going through episodes arriving. And it would be like Messianic complexes, or just delusions about them, about the monastic. So it can manifest outwardly in different ways, but it can also be completely invisible, and the person experiencing it can keep it mostly to themselves. I've alluded to this before, but Paramahansa Ramakrishna made an analogy about a person going through a spiritual awakening, likening them to a ball of dough being tossed into a vat of hot ghee. And initially, there's water in there, and it's got to boil out. And so in the initial phases of an awakening, this is when these types of delusions can really make themselves apparent. I would say the mildest example would be, besides somebody who just totally bottled it up, would be to at least be wanting to talk about that subject. And not necessarily in a way where they wanted to join a movement, but it would be possible that they'd want to do that, if only to find some corroborating experience in others. But it's such a change from the normal state of being that they definitely want to explore it with others and talk about it. And it's best to be selective, of course, because there are people who may try to get you committed. There are ways to determine whether or not that change is bringing one from perhaps a deeply, deeply unconscious state to sort of the predominant state of identification with thought and form, of unconsciousness, and identification with deeply traumatic or disturbing thought forms. Because in the falling away of that, sort of the remapping of the neural pathways, the experience, the differential between the initial state and kind of the ascension into just the predominant state, just the neutral state, can be profound. But when it's discovered how to let go of things like that, there's a continued letting go. After things are kind of neutral buoyancy in terms of emotion, there's a continued letting go because results are being had. And so this unburdening of energy as thought forms are given less attention, or there's a lack of care for them for a lack of identification with their subject. As those sort of skins thin and dissolve the thought form, the complex, the energy is released. And so all this energy starts to become palpable and perhaps even moving into different areas or getting stuck and concentrated. It can take an act of concentration to pierce the veil, as it were, with respect to the ego and the energy body. So if there's been a certain amount of surrender and there's unencumbered energy, it still may only be felt as sort of emotions. But concentration can bring the mind into a one-pointedness that causes there to be a perception of the energy body in some place. And then through a continued letting go, that can expand, and one-pointedness of mind, of concentration, which is a part of a branch of the Eightfold Path. It's like a spear. And so there are ways of bringing concentration to bear. It's best achieved through the immersion of attention in something non-relational, something that doesn't bring proliferation of countervailing ideas with other ideas, nothing relating to a person. So starting from gross to subtle, the feeling of where the body touches the surface, and then that there's breathing, and that all these things just are. And meditation promotes a stillness and a non-reactiveness. I saw a video recently. I'll link to it in the description. I can't remember the guy's name. He's a really smart guy. But he was talking about nostalgia, and how it destroys the soul. Really, it constricts the soul. It hems attention into a deep part of the timeline that is only mental. So it's a disconnection from reality. But nostalgia is really just one kind of disconnection from reality. Any kind of thought forms can envelop attention and separate awareness from the truth of this moment. It's almost like they all take shifts doing it. So it could be nostalgia, it could be looking into the future. It could be any kind of entertainment. Just something that seems better than what's going on right now. I mean, nostalgia has real world opportunity costs, but as a general category, daydreams have an opportunity cost in terms of your state of being. That because they overlap each other like roof tiles, these different separators, it's not really known what would appear in their absence. And even if they can be stopped, even if those thoughts can be stopped, the reason why they're being stopped is important in terms of the experience that that stoppage brings and whether or not it persists in its character as well. If through willpower the mind is stopped, it's been likened to a wild horse. It will eventually throw you off. And the change in experience brought about by that, of course, will be temporary, but also won't yield the same insight as if the mind were to be still by virtue of there being nothing appearing in it that triggers the identity. So it's like there are emotional gears that are there because things are identified with thoughts, forms. And then the thoughts also have gears. So those teeth come together. And so when the thought gears just stop, but they're still engaged to identity gears. There's no change in the experience other than really the stoppage. It's the identity side of the equation that really determines the experience and the insights gained from it and the duration. If the gears of identity are broken, the thoughts really can spin and even things can happen. But the teeth of identity aren't there to be pushed. They're stripped. The gears are stripped. And so there's just no reaction. There can certainly be visceral reactions, the kind that facilitate action, like in exigent circumstance, like a fight or something. That all works. And all the bodily appetites still persist, but they're not all at the behest of ideas, of thoughts. So there's actually a conservation of energy, and that occurs. So all energy is transmutable and I'm speaking of the energy body. So sex energy, food digestion energy, all we're energetic beings, and it can all be purposed for different things. So there is this movement, the no-fap movement of retaining sexual energy. That energy that's retained is also used in thought, in thinking, and the emotional triggers that result from thoughts reacted to. So even if there's still activity of that nature, if energy isn't devoured by the brain, which the brain does devour a lot of calories, a lot of energy, if it and the endocrine system and the emotions and such aren't burning up energy, it has a similar effect. Whatever physiological effects occur, from the actual retention of semen, besides increased risk of prostate cancer. I'm not a doctor. I can't say, but it can be demonstrated that if energy is not being churned away on rumination, then there's an expansiveness and also an ascension. But there has to be a grounding, or there can be a sort of a psychosis. Sort of, it's probably akin to spiritual psychosis, or is a version of it, a presentation where there's a grandiosity that arises, the thought that one is special, or that the experience somehow plays into prophecy. That one has superpowers and thus some role to play, that one is a reincarnation of some important person in history. That is a play of the identity. It's hanging on. But that will burn away eventually, unless material circumstances change, right? So there are individuals who have been recognized at certain points in their unfolding, and who knows whether or not that unfoldment just keeps progressing. The Buddha said it was unstoppable beyond a certain point, that it will just keep going on. But like Ramakrishna said, it's like everyone who goes through this change of perception, there's the possibility that, I mean, there's going to be that steam coming out of that dough. It's like something is broken, like a glow stick. But attention, or rather identification with an even subtler thing is identification nonetheless. So there can be identification with going from gross to subtle, the form, then the thoughts, the ideas, emotions, and then the energy body. But they're all identification with some subtle or gross thing. And so to the extent that there's a care for them, there's a handle by which things can be agitated internally. And also the amount of delusion, there's still some fractional amount of delusion, of identification with some dependently originated thing. I guess that's all.